The chamber became a battlefield. Trump fought for applause. Crockett fought for the people. One relied on bluster, the other on integrity, and when the two clashed in a one-on-one duel, only one voice held the room. So in the end, will Trump dominate, or will the small Jasmine crush him with truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The cold white lights cut through the chamber, burning away every shadow until the room felt like a stage built for judgment. Cameras crawled across the scene, locking onto every polished wooden chair, the massive flag hanging like a warning, and the red microphones glowing hot, ticking like bombs about to go off. At the center, Donald Trump sat already in place. Arms crossed, his grin stretched wide, dripping with smug certainty. He believed this was his performance, his arena, the place where he would once again crown himself the victor. Then came Jasmine Crockett, small in frame, but her stride hit the floor like a hammer. Navy blazer, sharp eyes of steel, her hand resting on untouched documents. She didn't need paper, she was the evidence. The crowd buzzed, senators, whispering reporters, adjusting focused citizens leaning forward. Above them all, one question flashed like a sentence carved in stone. Who truly fights for the American people? The silence after Crockett's entrance still lingered when Trump suddenly leaned into the microphone. He smacked the table lightly with his palm, the sharp crack echoing across the chamber and snapping every eye toward him. His voice cut through the air like a blade. If you really dare, let's turn this into a direct debate. No script, no rules, just me and you. The words landed heavy, daring, dripping with the confidence of a man used to controlling the room. The audience erupted into a split reaction. On one side, a burst of laughter and applause as loyalists cheered his bravado. On the other, an uneasy silence spread, people frozen in their seats. The scrape of chairs and the clatter of a pen hitting the floor rang louder than the cheers, amplifying the tension. The atmosphere thickened, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't shift or fumble or even glance around. Sitting tall, spine straight, her gaze locked on Trump like a laser. Her voice was calm, steady, unshaken, as she answered in words that cracked like thunder, "I was born ready." The chamber jolted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, but the sheer weight of it flipped the energy instantly. Laughter evaporated into a sudden hush. The applause stopped mid-clap. The cameras zoomed close, catching Trump's grin, stiffened the corners of his mouth, tightening just enough to reveal the sting. He sat back but leaned forward again, almost instantly unwilling to let the silence crown her. The red glow of the microphones reflected off his face, and for the first time that evening, it wasn't triumph that filled the room. It was suspense. The moderator cleared his throat, barely disguising his unease, and delivered the first question with the gravity of a judge reading a verdict. What does it mean to fight for the American people? It was simple on paper, but the way it dropped into the silence made it feel like a hammer striking steel. Trump seized it immediately. He sat up straighter, slammed his palm down again for emphasis, and let his words thunder. I brought jobs back. I cut taxes. I stood up to the media. I fought the bureaucrats. I fought harder for the American people than anyone else ever has. His delivery was sharp, each phrase pitched like a victory medal pinned to his chest. He spread his arms, wide eyes, sweeping the room, waiting for the validation he had always commanded. A few pockets of applause broke out. Loyalists clapped, nodding, murmuring approval. Trump leaned back in his chair, his grin swelling with satisfaction, as though he had already declared victory. It was the same rhythm he had mastered for years, boast, pause, bask in the reaction. But tonight the rhythm faltered. The applause was sparse, thin, hollow. Then Crockett leaned in. She didn't raise her voice, didn't pound the table. Her words were quieter, sharper, every syllable deliberate. Fighting isn't when the cameras are rolling. Fighting is when no one's watching, when there are no applause lines. The air shifted again, the silence gripping tighter with every word. Her voice carried the weight of memory. My mother worked 2 shifts in a hospital just to keep the lights on. My friends, some of the smartest kids I knew, never made it because they never got the chance. That's what I grew up watching. That's what shaped me. Each line landed heavy, raw, and unpolished but undeniable. And when she finally lifted her gaze, locking eyes with Trump, her tone dropped into a strike. You fought from the top. I fought from the bottom. The chamber shook, not with noise, but with the absence of it. The smirks vanished, the whispers died. Trump leaned forward as if to cut her off, his mouth twitching with words that never came. But Crockett's stare held him there, pinned like a witness caught under a spotlight. For once, Donald Trump, the man who thrived on interruption, was silent. And in that silence, the room itself shifted sides. The fight had only just begun. The weight of Crockett's words still hung in the air, and the silence stretched long enough to sting. Trump shifted in his seat, forcing himself to look composed. He adjusted his bright red tie with deliberate slowness, lips curling into a smile that looked more strained than confident. His fingers tapped against the table in a steady rhythm, but if anyone looked close enough, they could see the tremor in his hand. He wanted to appear unshaken, yet every movement betrayed the pressure pressing down on him. Crockett didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her eyes locked on Trump, like a predator tracking its prey. She didn't need to add another word. Her silence was louder than any speech. The chamber itself had become her weapon, and with every second she held that gaze, the room transformed into a battlefield. Her calmness made Trump's forced composure look like panic in slow motion. The audience shifted restlessly. Some leaned back in their chairs trying to process the tension, while others leaned forward caught in the pull of the moment. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across notepads while camera lenses zoomed in closer and closer, desperate to capture every flicker of expression. Every cough, every shuffle of paper sounded like an explosion in the stillness, magnifying the suspense. The moderator finally broke, his voice rough, betraying the strain in his throat. "If both parties agree, we will proceed in the form of a direct debate." His words wavered slightly, like he too felt the gravity of what had just shifted in the room. All eyes darted back to the two figures at the table, waiting for their next move. The chamber no longer felt like a standard hearing. It was now a trial, a stage of judgment laid bare. Trump thought he had set the trap, but the audience sensed it. He had already stepped into his own pit. The moderator's voice was steady, but the weight of his words turned the air even heavier. What does integrity under pressure truly mean? The question dropped like a hammer, echoing through the chamber. All eyes snapped back to Trump, who pushed back his chair with a scrape that cut through the silence. He stood tall, chest out, his hands slicing the air as he began. "I have been through witch hunts," Trump thundered, his voice rolling across the room. "They tried to take me down with lies. They tried to destroy me politically and personally. But I stood strong. I never backed down. That is integrity." His hand came down hard on the table, his face flushed with conviction. He paused, deliberately scanning the crowd for applause, waiting for the wave he had always counted on. A handful of supporters clapped, their sound echoing awkwardly in the vast room, but the rest of the chamber remained still, eyes watchful, expressions unreadable. The silence swallowed the applause almost instantly, leaving Trump standing with his arms open, waiting for validation that never arrived. His smile faltered for a second before he forced it back into place, lips tight, chin high. Then it was Crockett's turn. She didn't stand. She didn't move at all. Instead, her voice dropped low, pulling every ear closer, as though the room itself leaned in. "I was a young lawyer once," she began, her words cutting through the hush. 17 years old, that was the age of my client, a boy named Jamal Rivers. He was accused of armed robbery. The weight in her tone made the audience shift uneasily in their seats. She let the silence breathe before continuing. The evidence was weak. A single witness who later admitted they couldn't see clearly. But the prosecution wanted a win. They pushed Jamal to plead guilty, 10 years in prison. And if he went to trial and lost 30 years. The numbers hit like a fist to the gut, pulling murmurs from the gallery. Crockett's eyes narrowed and she looked out into the chamber, as if Jamal himself was sitting there. "He asked me what he should do. I looked at him, terrified, alone, and I told him, 'If you didn't do it, we will fight. We will fight all the way.'" Her voice didn't crack. It grew stronger, sharper. "We fought, and we won." Jamal walked out of that courtroom free. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Crockett's final words cut through it like steel. Integrity isn't about applause. Integrity is standing beside someone when they have no one else. Her voice hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, as though carved into the walls themselves. The chamber reacted not with cheers, but with the scrape of chairs against the floor, as some shifted uncomfortably. A few senators lowered their heads, unable to meet the gaze of their colleagues. Reporters froze mid-scribble, their pens dangling useless in their hands. Camera zoomed in close, catching the exact moment Trump's lips pressed into a hard line, his jaw tightening as his forced smile evaporated. In that instant, the balance of the room tilted. The man who had thrived on spectacle stood muted, while the woman who carried lived truth had turned silence into her weapon. And the tension only deepened as the fight pressed forward. The weight of Crockett's story still lingered in the chamber, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Trump reached for the water bottle in front of him, twisting the cap too quickly, the plastic crackling in his hand. He brought it to his lips and gulped hard, the sound of swallowing unnervingly loud in the still room. His fingers trembled as he set it down the bottle, rattling softly against the wooden table. He darted his eyes across the audience, searching for approval for the nods and smirks that usually came so easily. But what met him instead were cold, steady stares, detached, unyielding, as if the room itself had already moved on from him. Crockett didn't flinch. She sat with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze unwavering, her silence deliberate. Every second she remained still only magnified the weight of her truth. She didn't need to speak again. Her restraint was louder than any outburst. The camera zoomed in on her face, catching the quiet confidence of a woman who had just shifted the balance of power. The longer she held her ground, the clearer it became. Trump was losing control and Crockett was seizing it without lifting a finger. This was no pause. It was a transfer of power visible to everyone watching. The silence still clung to the room when the moderator leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of the next strike. What would you say to a working-class family that has lost faith in politics? The words cut the air cleanly, and before the question had even finished echoing off the walls, Trump lurched forward. He cut in sharply, his voice booming, as though volume could anchor authority. When I was in charge, they lived better, he declared, his chin high. There were more jobs. Prices were lower. I delivered results. Real results. That's the truth. His tone dripped with confidence, and he hammered the table with each line as if stamping them into the record. He leaned back, a smile flashing across his face, certain that he had landed a decisive blow. For a heartbeat, he waited for the applause he thought was inevitable. But the chamber did not erupt. The claps that came were scattered thin, swallowed quickly by the hush that followed. The weight of anticipation returned, and then all eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. She sat still, composed, the calm in her demeanor as sharp as a blade. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate, each word carrying the force of lived truth. People aren't just tired of words, she said slowly, her gaze never leaving Trump. They're tired of being lied to. The room tightened instantly. She leaned slightly forward, her hands folding gently on the table as she continued. Picture a family where the mother and father both work 2 jobs, but they still can't afford medicine. Picture their kids going to a school that lost its funding, where teachers buy supplies out of their own pockets. Picture their cousin laid off when the factory closed despite all the promises about saving American jobs. The words struck like blows, unrelenting, vivid. Crockett's tone never wavered, but each sentence painted a picture that made the silence unbearable. Then she delivered the line that shattered what little control Trump had left. They looked for a president to help them, but what they found was a man on a golf course tweeting insults. The chamber cracked open with noise. Murmurs spread like wildfire, chairs scraped back, and voices rose in the gallery. A few shouted, "That's right," while others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The tension turned electric, the kind of reaction that couldn't be staged or contained. Trump froze. His body stiffened as his hand tightened around the water bottle knuckles, whitening. He didn't rise, didn't argue, didn't even smile. His lips pressed thin as he gripped the plastic so hard it creaked in his hand. The man who thrived on comebacks sat wordless, pinned under the weight of her truth. In that moment, the room knew it. The strike had landed, and the balance had shifted further. Crockett hadn't just answered the question, she had redrawn the battlefield. The chamber was still vibrating from the last exchange, when the moderator, pale but steady, lifted his notes. He looked from one table to the other, drew a breath, and let the words fall like a gavel. What should the people remember about you after tonight? The sentence hung in the white light, bright and unforgiving, and even the cameras seemed to pause as their lenses tightened. The red glow on the microphones throbbed like warning beacons daring one last misstep. A hush settled that felt less like silence and more like a countdown to impact. Trump moved first. He leaned into the mic, shoulders squared, and delivered his lines with a practiced glide. I want them to remember me as the man who fought against everyone. I didn't need to run. I had everything, but I did it because I love America. He paused there, chin high, expecting the familiar wave to crest over him, the validation that usually followed on cue. But the chamber did not move. No applause, no roar, only the faint thrum of the air vents and a cough someone tried to swallow. The stillness put a hard edge on his words, and the smile that followed looked like a mask drying into place. He adjusted a cufflink, filling dead air with the smallest movements he could control. The moment stretched brittle and dangerous. All eyes shifted to Jasmine Crockett. She sat forward only an inch enough to claim the space and spoke with a quiet that carried. I want them to remember that I listened. I did not come here to talk about myself, but to speak for those who never get a microphone. The murmur in the gallery shut off as if a switch had been thrown, and even the scribbling of pens faded. She let one heartbeat pass, then finished with the blade she had saved for last. There is a difference between a performer and a public servant. One lives for applause. One lives for accountability. The words didn't explode. They sank in heavy and permanent like nails driven through the floorboards. A shiver of recognition passed through the room, the kind that makes people sit straighter without knowing why. No one dared to speak first. The impact rippled outward in a slow, undeniable wave. Reporters froze with pens mid-stroke. A few senators stared at the tabletop as if the wood itself might answer for them. Trump did not interject. His hands folded together, fingers lacing tight, and his eyes drifted down to the grain of the desk. The red wash from the microphones edged his profile while he sat motionless, and the stage he had assumed was his slipped away beneath him. Around him, the seats seemed farther away, the lights harsher, the air thinner. He clasped his hands tighter as if trying to hold on to a stage that no longer belonged to him. For the first time that night, he did not command the moment. The moment commanded him. When the microphones went dark, the verdict hung in the air. People stood slowly, as if their legs needed permission to move. Chairs, scraped papers were folded with care, and the crowd drifted toward the exits like a jury dismissed. Nobody rushed. They spoke in hushed tones, trading looks that said it all. A Capitol officer opened a door and kept his eyes down, as if he too knew something had shifted. The room felt like a courthouse after a final ruling, solemn and strangely clean, as though the noise had been scrubbed away. Back in the press, bullpen producers barked orders and screens lit up in rows. Editors clipped the moment and marked it with a red banner. Breaking. Anchors reset their posture and rolled the tape again and again, freezing on her final words for clarity. Every channel replayed the same clean strike. There is a difference between a performer and a public servant. One lives for applause. One lives for accountability. Analysts tried to soften it, then gave up and called it what it was, a standard set in plain speech. By the top of the hour, the montage had a headline of its own, and the verdict was playing coast to coast. Online, the clip detonated like a flare in midnight fog. Within minutes, feeds were stacked with the same 20-second punch, subtitled and looped for emphasis. A simple headline raced with it. Trump brought down by the truth stamped over her face in the glowing mic. View counters spun like odometers. 1 million, then 2, then 5, and still climbing. Group chats lit up, relatives sent links to relatives, and even sleepy accounts woke to share it with a single line, "Watch this." By late afternoon, the algorithm treated it like a public service announcement and pushed it to everyone who had ever clicked debate justice or hope. In living rooms, break rooms, and bus stops, people watched with their mouths tight and their eyes wet. Working families nodded through the pain, hearing their own bills and trade-offs in every syllable. Older viewers wiped their cheeks and whispered to no one in particular. Someone finally said it. Communities that rarely get airtime pressed replay not to celebrate a takedown, but to breathe in the proof that their lives count. A pastor texted the clip to his congregation, a nurse posted it between shifts, and a laid-off worker sent it to his son with, "This is what I mean." And as the sun went down, the city lights came on like witnesses, marking the end of a day that felt less like politics and more like a record finally set straight. News tickers scrolled the quote in all caps, while Quran writers argued over whether to call it a turning point or a reckoning. Outside the Capitol, footsteps tapped the marble slow and echoing, and the night air tasted like relief. No confetti, no anthem, just the feeling that truth had finally made the loudest sound. By morning, the noise had cooled into something sharper meaning. What happened on that floor no longer felt like a partisan brawl. It read like a civic lesson written in real time. Commentators stopped scoring points and started circling principles, asking what the country expects from anyone who asks for power. The clash, stripped of chance, in team colors, stood as a case study in public ethics you could actually feel. It said the job is not to win the moment, but to carry the burden that comes after the moment. The first lesson was plain enough to write on a chalkboard: leadership is listening. Listening is not a pause before a comeback. It is the work itself, the act of putting other lives at the center. You could see the difference in posture and timing, in who waited for applause and who waited for truth to land. A leader who listens treats silence as a tool, not a threat, and hears the pain that statistics hide. When people saw that on screen, they recognized a version of leadership they could bring to their homes, schools, and city halls. The second lesson was heavier, and it cut closer to the bone. Integrity is standing beside the vulnerable. Integrity is not a medal you pin on yourself, and it is not a caption under a photo. It is proximity to risk. It looks like keeping your promise when the cameras are off and the stakes belong to someone who cannot afford to lose. It refuses to trade a stranger's future for the safety of a headline, even when every shortcut whispers to take it. Once people understood that shape, they could measure every speech by the distance between words and sacrifice. Classrooms picked it up first. Teachers clipped the segment and built lessons around it, asking students to map claims to duties, feelings to facts. Debates that once chased outrage now chased standards: who listened, who proved, who owned the consequences of their choices. On whiteboards, the prompt was simple: what does public service require of you when nobody notices? And the answers grew more practical, not more loud. Civics, too long a sleepy period, suddenly felt like fire drills for character, where practice might one day save a life you will never meet. Outside school walls, neighborhoods treated the moment like a shared handbook. Clips traveled from church group threads to union chats to family texts, captioned with 4 words: a manifesto of conscience. People did not forward it for spectacle. They forwarded it as permission to expect better where they live and work. Nonprofits used it to open meetings, nurses played it during overnight breaks, and coaches replayed it before practice to define the word team. By sundown, the lesson had crossed the usual lines, reminding strangers that government is not a show to watch, but a duty to hold. And if that standard holds, politics becomes smaller than duty, and duty becomes the measure of public promise, kept or broken. The shock of that night did not vanish with the cameras. By the next morning, analysts and columnists, even those long loyal to Trump, admitted the same thing for the first time: he had been beaten, not by tricks, not by volume, but by plain truth. Commentators replayed the silence in his seat, the way his eyes dropped, and called it a turning point. What they had once dismissed as style or theater now looked like weakness when faced with lived experience. One pundit summed it up bluntly on air: Trump lost not to strategy but to honesty. Crockett, on the other hand, emerged from the chamber not just as a congresswoman, but as a symbol. Editorials described her as the public servant who showed what service looks like. Radio hosts called her the conscience of the hearing. Social media timelines were flooded with her name paired with a new title: the servant of the people. She had not shouted her way to the spotlight, she had seized it by proving that power can be grounded in humility. The message was not partisan, it was human. Clips of her final words circulated with captions bolded in red: the truth can be buried under lights, but it never goes out. Students repeated it in classrooms, pastors quoted it from pulpits, and activists painted it on banners. Her warning about performers and servants rang like a civic hymn. True leadership is not about basking in glory, it is about carrying the pain of others. Viewers recognized themselves in that lesson, and it spread faster than spin could catch. In schools, teachers downloaded the video and played it as if it were a primary source document. History teachers framed it beside passages from Lincoln and King, asking their students to compare the language of accountability. Debate clubs rewound the tape, analyzing tone pauses and the way truth itself silenced a practiced showman. It stopped being just an event. It became a case study in character. Young voices quoted her lines back to each other, trying them on like armor. Across the country, children and college students alike began to speak of the hearing as a moment they would remember years later. It wasn't politics, it was history. In cafeterias and lecture halls, they retold the exchange as if they had witnessed a crack in the facade of power. Parents told their kids that's what courage looks like. That's what honesty sounds like. The memory of Trump slumped at the table was a warning. The image of Crockett holding the silence was a lesson. Among ordinary people, the effect was deeper still. Families who had long tuned out debates felt something stir, as though politics had finally spoken in their language. Workers who had lost jobs, elders who had lived through broken promises, communities that never saw themselves reflected on the stage they watched Crockett, and realized leadership could still belong to them. For once, they felt represented not in slogans, but in truth laid bare. By week's end, newspapers and late-night hosts alike gave the hearing a new name. It was no longer just another committee session or political clash. It was remembered as the trial of truth, the night a man addicted to performance was undone by a woman devoted to service. And in that name lay the verdict: spectacle had been beaten, and the people had seen what it means to be served, not entertained. The echoes of that hearing still pulsed through the nation, but the question left behind was simple and sharp. What now the room had witnessed: truth sliced through spectacle, but truth without action fades like smoke. The silence that froze Trump in his chair was only the beginning. The rest belonged to those watching. This was no time for bystanders, no time for spectators leaning back in comfort. It was the kind of moment that demanded a choice, a line drawn not on paper, but in lives. The call to action was not hidden in legal jargon or wrapped in political slogans. It was plain as Crockett's voice when she said, "There is a difference between a performer and a public servant." That sentence was more than a line, it was a summons. It meant people could no longer cheer for noise and call it leadership. It meant silence in the face of lies was no longer acceptable. If someone in power refused to carry the burden, then the burden shifted to the citizens to decide who deserved the mic and who didn't. In every living room, in every classroom, replaying the clip, the demand was the same: show up. Show up at town halls where politicians expect empty chairs. Show up at the ballot box even when cynicism whispers it won't matter. Show up for the neighbor who cannot afford a lawyer, for the nurse working doubles, for the factory worker who lost his pension. Integrity is not a spectator sport. It is built in small, stubborn acts of presence. The hearing was proof that one voice can shake the floor, but only if others answer it. The call grew louder as the replay spread. Parents told their children, "Don't just watch, remember." Teachers turned the clip into homework, asking students how they would define service in their own lives. Clergy leaned over pulpits and said, "This is the fight of our time, not for applause, but for accountability." Action meant more than marching slogans. It meant listening, holding leaders to their word, and refusing to mistake performance for service again. And here was the truth: democracy survives not on the loudest voice, but on the most faithful hands. The call was not to storm stages or break microphones. It was to hold steady, to demand answers, to reward honesty and punish deceit, not with violence, but with votes, with pressure, with relentless truth. Crockett had shown what it looked like in that chamber. Now the question was whether the rest of the country would carry that torch outside its walls. The message was not complicated: stand up, speak out, refuse to settle. The next act was not hers alone. It was everyone's. In the silence after her final words, the stage turned to the people. The cameras might have gone cold, but the responsibility was only beginning. The action was clear: take the lesson, turn it into motion, and refuse to let truth be buried again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.